Hello and welcome to the RPG College Videos in the Raw. Um, for those who have not been here before, Videos in the Raw are completely recorded and then shared with you without any editing really being done, other than by, if somebody else hosts the video like a convention or something, they might put a border or something on it. But there's no editing being done. These are just in the raw. I don't have any editing software, so you get it how I make it. Some of them will go directly to Twitch, and some will be recorded and then uploaded to YouTube. And this edition of Videos in the Raw, we are going to be talking about creating better boss encounters in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of people online have been talking about how their boss encounters, their big bad, or the BBEG as they like to call it, big bad evil guy, in their games are lackluster. They come up against them, and then their party just wipes the floor with them in one and a half rounds, 2 rounds, and they're over with. Or on the flip side, they're just too deadly. I mean, the monster wipes the floor with the players in one and a half rounds with no real chance to get away. And so you got to kind of balance your boss encounters so that you're making sure that everybody in your game is having fun and they're memorable, because that's really when you play a game, it's that big ending scene of an arc that you want to go back and tell your friends about. Those are the epic battles when people do those sacrificial runs to maybe let the rest of the party get away. It's the ones where the underdog comes back from the edge of oblivion and wins the day. These are the battles that people write home about. These are the ones that they tell everybody, that helps recruit more players to our game. Just like when you're playing a video game or an MMO, which were, of course, kind of based on Dungeons and Dragons in the first place. A lot of them were. When you come to a big boss at the end of a video game, that's the one that you want to get everybody together for. That's when you call all your friends together. Hey, I'm about to challenge the boss. Come watch. That's the epic part of the streams that you see on game Twitch streaming. You really want to see them take on the dragon, take on the giant beholder, or whatnot. And so your boss battles need to be something special. You don't want your run-of-the-mill battle with some goblins or giant rats to rival your big battle with a giant or an evil djinn or something like that. So you really want to put some thought into your boss encounter. So first off, boss encounter should be customized to your party. And now, first off, this might sound metagamey because you're using information that you have when you're building your encounter, but it is, but it isn't as well, because you're trying to make the encounter fit the people that are going to encounter it, because certain abilities will make an encounter a cakewalk, and other abilities are absolutely necessary, or an encounter can't be defeated at all. And so you do want to take that into account. And if you've ever read fantasy novels or played through a lot of video games, you realize that the prophesied ones, the big adventurers, are the ones that you're coming in, and they're the ones that were foretold. And if there's a big foretelling, that means that some of their abilities, some prescient being might have been able to have predicted that would help them kind of battle and prepare to be challenged. And so it adds a little bit more verisimilitude, a little bit more immersion into the story itself. If the players don't have the perfect solution for everything, or the monsters have a perfect counter for everything, but there's a good mix of both. And so you do want to customize to your party. And examples of that is if you've got a party that's mostly damage dealing, tanky type characters, then don't rely on boss monsters. They're just a bucket of hit points and defenses. You want to have monsters that have other ways of hanging around and countering these tanky types. They do a large amount of damage as well, so they can attack your tanks. They got good to hits based on the really high armor classes of your tanks. They have alternate ways to hit your tanks so that your paladin with a 22 armor class isn't wading through with never getting hit by anything, because your monsters also have attacks against dexterity saving throws and constitution saving throws and wisdom saving throws. You want a mixture of saving throw saves in there, because different members of your party are going to have better in different types of saves anyway, and so you want to spread that out. Some monsters are going to use a lot of area of effect powers, like fireballs and lightning bolts, while others are going to just get in there and mix it up in melee. A lot of big bosses have minions that they're just going to mainly wear you down with minions before you come up against them. So take your boss encounter and customize it to your party, and that'll be involved with all the way through this process. You're going to keep your party in mind when you're building your boss encounters. Now, you can build a generic boss encounter suitable for most parties by simply keeping in mind the 4 basic combat roles. 4th edition did really good about detailing what the combat roles were. If you play massive multiplayer online role-playing games, you'll recognize some of the terms they use for it. Of course, I already used one, was the tank, or as 4th edition called it, the defender. They're the ones that are really good at taking damage. Similar to that, and probably one of the favorite characters to be played, is the DPS, or the damage per second or damage per round, DPR, DPS, which 4th edition called the striker. They were the ones that were good at dealing damage, more and more damage to wear down the enemies. They were your frontline damage dealers. Then you had your controllers. Now, controllers controlled the battlefield in some way. They might slow characters. They might use area of effect abilities to control where you could go, make difficult terrain, hit a whole bunch of minions all at once to clear them out. Your wizards were that, and they call those controllers, or area of effect people. And then finally you have your buffers. Your buffers, or your leaders, as 4th edition called it, were the ones that increased the party's ability in battle while decreasing the enemy's ability to react in battle. They're your healers. They're the ones that put bless or curse out. They bless the party, they curse the enemy. They do like fairy fire to show the invisible characters. And so what you want to do is you want to build a boss encounter that has something to counter each one of those ability rolls, and possibly something that's weak against each of those ability rolls is a good balance. That way you got a good back and forth going on in the game, because your average D&D encounter of an equal difficulty is going to take no more than 5 rounds to go through, but your boss battle is really the one that you want to take 10 or 15 or 20 rounds to accomplish, not because you want to drag it out, but because you want to see some of those longer lasting abilities maybe not be the solution to everything. And so these are the ways you want to build your encounters. And that brings me into the next point, which is watch your action economy. Fourth edition really started coining the phrase of action economy, and fifth edition embraced it. In fifth edition, every character has three basic actions in their action economy. They have their action, which is where most attacks fall under. They have the movement part of the action, which they can now split up, but it's how they move during their turn. And then they have a bonus action during their turn. And it's usually bonus actions are made possible by other actions you do during the turn, or it's a specific like speed of a spell or ability. Like a bard's inspiration is a bonus action to grant. And healing word is a bonus action spell that the clerics or bards might cast on the characters to give them some quick healing mid-combat without giving up their main action to do so. So that's where your bonus actions come in. But bonus actions are also, like I said, triggered by other actions. Like if a fighter wielding two weapons uses an attack action to hit you with their main weapon, they can then turn around and do a bonus action to hit you with their offhand weapon. But the offhand weapon is only usable if they first use the attack action to trigger it. Same thing with like a monk who uses unarmed strike in their martial arts. If they hit you with an unarmed strike or a monk weapon with their main attack, then they can bonus action either hit you once more with a unarmed strike, or they could spend a key point and for a bonus action do what's called a flurry of blows and hit you for two more attacks. And so this is part of the action economy. And then the other main action in the action economy is a reaction, which usually happens on another person's turn, and it's triggered by that turn. Most commonly, we think of the attack of opportunity when we're talking about the reaction. And reactions are important that you keep in mind. You only get one of in any given turn of combat, and that means from the beginning of combat all the way back to your turn again, you get one. It could be on your turn, it could be on somebody else's turn, but it's in reaction to what somebody else does. And so those are the different types of actions you can do, and that's your action economy. Well, your creatures in 5th edition are expected to go up against, by challenge rating, 3 to 5 characters of their challenge rating to be considered an equal combat. And then the entire challenge rating system is based around that 3 to 5 characters to 1 character ratio. And a single monster has as hard time by himself than going against a party of 5 people. If they each have an attack action, that's 5 actions to the possible 1 action of a single creature. So you have to look at your action economy and compensate for that. And as a general rule of thumb, I say especially in a boss encounter, but in most encounters, if you want the encounter to be considered medium or harder, the bad guys, the enemies, have to start with half as many rounded up to equally as many actions as the party has. So your 5 first level characters have 5 actions. We're not going to worry about their bonus actions, their reactions, but they have 5 actions in their action economy. That means that you want to be able to do between 3 and 5, maybe 6 actions on the bad guy's side. And the reason I say up to equal is because a lot of times in the lower levels especially, what you're going to do is you're going to send one combatant out per each player character that's in the battle so that they can each get engaged. A lot of your lower level boss fights are more like group fights. But there are other ways to create that artificial action economy for your boss battles. If you do want to send them against an individual bad guy, uh, consider doing things like giving the bad guy multi-attack. Using bad guys that have multi-attack, they get 2 or 3 attacks in a turn. Like it's claw bite, or 2 claws, or double weapon attack. That counts as 2 actions in their action economy, and that counterbalances the fact that 2 people are going to be attacking them. So that's really what you want to do is that. And then the other thing you can do is sprinkle in what we call minion monsters. In 4th edition, minion was actually a role for a monster. A minion monster had 1 hit point. They died really easy, but they were immune to like certain auto damage things, and they usually had higher defenses and stuff, so they're a little bit harder to hit. They might have been a higher technical challenge rating than the party, but that 1 hit point made it to where they were a glass cannon, and they dropped. And they were good for just bulking up the boss with some servitors. 5th edition doesn't technically have the minions, but you can, of course, add them in. It's a great way to do it. Or you can use lower CR monsters to kind of beef up your encounter. Good example is a vampire in 4th edition would have Vampire Spawn as his minion, and use those to give you a couple more actions in the action economy. It's really what they're there for. They're going to fall pretty quickly, especially if the party goes for the strategy of knocking out the minions first. But if the party focuses on the boss first, the minions will have a little bit of a free reign and have a chance to whittle them down for the few lucky rolls, because everybody hits on a natural 20. So even a weaker monster can whittle you down if they get lucky rolls, and they'll have other abilities that can happen. Other things you can do to counteract the action economy, other than giving more basic attacks to your bosses or bringing in minions, is to use auras that do auto damage or create control effects that are always on, like troglodytes who have a stench that whenever you start your turn in their area, you have an ill effect that happens. These are ways that you can counteract a little bit too, because your tanks can now not necessarily get up close without feeling the effect of the aura. Or like a fire elemental that has an automatic rebound kind of thing, where whenever you attack them with a physical attack, they might have something in there that says that the attacker takes automatic burn damage unless they're resistant to fire. Those are the kind of things that you can put in, whether it's in the monster or not, because 1, they make sense for the type of creature it is, and 2, it helps counteract some of the imbalance in the action economy. So action economy is a very important part of the game. Now, another thing you can do with your boss monsters is you can turn any other monster into more of a boss monster by giving them legendary or lair actions. Now, a lot of monsters in the monster manual already have this, like dragons, but other creatures don't have it by default. But to turn them into a boss monster, you would give them a legendary action. And the legendary action could be something simple, something that doesn't automatically start with a legendary action. I give them what we call the boss legendary action, and there's other people online that use the same philosophy. And that means that they get anywhere from 1 to 3 legendary actions per turn, but not on their turn sequence. They always come in at the end of somebody else's turn, kind of like a reaction, but they don't count as their reaction. And these legendary actions are usually picked from a list. The basic set that I use is they can use any basic attack that they have, attack action. They can do a recovery action. A recovery action means that they could either heal a small amount of hit points, like a hit die's worth, for the creature maybe, or automatically remove a condition that is on the creature, and a lot of times you want to limit how many times that one can be used, depending. Excuse me. Or automatically get to make an additional saving throw to shrug off a condition, or they can take a move action or an additional special ability that's not an action, but maybe it's a bonus action normally, but they're allowed to use it as a special legendary action. Like, for instance, a grappling creature that gets a bonus action to attack somebody they've got grappled could also do that attack again, like a bite attack, as a legendary action at the end of the grappled creature's turn, as well as, their turn. So that's a way for them to get another hit in. It gives them another action in the action economy. And that's what we're looking for in balancing out your action economies. Now, in addition to action economies and customizing towards your party, you also want to use your environment when you're doing boss attacks. That means that if you're fighting a fire elemental, you might have lava flows around, or spurts of fire that come up from geysers in the floor, or things of that. That actually plays into lair actions, which is part of the action economy from before. If you catch a monster in its lair, which is a lot of times what you're doing with the boss has set the stage a little bit better than just a random encounter somewhere else in the dungeon. And so the boss might have traps set up. They might have pitfalls and things that they can trigger, not exactly a trap as much as a hazard that they trigger. They might make the environment harder to deal with, like gaseous clouds and difficult terrain, and you can use that to make the encounters more difficult. You might have to swing on vines throughout the encounter because there's no solid footing. So if you can't either swing on vines with, making dex checks every time you go to make an attack or move, or fly, you might be at a severe disadvantage unless you can sit back on a shelf and shoot distance attacks at the monster. And so use your environment and customize it to your party a little bit, but don't make it look like it was tailor-made for your party, because that's going to get rid of people's ability to believe that this was not absolutely metagamed in by the DM. The DM can metagame. Unlike players, the DM is encouraged to metagame because his job is to make sure everybody's having fun. That means that if the boss is going down a little too quickly and it's becoming very lackluster, and you think that it's going to become a disappointing in battle, not because they got really, really lucky, but just because it's becoming disappointing, you could beef up the hit points of the monster. Because the characters don't know what the hit points of the monster are. You could always maximize the hit points of your boss. It's another way to make the boss a little bit tougher to deal with. But you can artificially bump their hit points up a little bit if you think that they're beating them a little bit too quickly, and it's not looking like they're enjoying the fact that they're beating them a little bit too quickly. It's anticlimactic, because you want to make it a climax worth the effort. I mean, you've built up to this boss encounter or this mini boss encounter, and you want to make it mean something. So use your environment and metagame a little bit, but again, you're not trying to kill the players when you're metagaming. Your metagaming should never cause the players to die outright. You're not a malicious individual. You're supposed to present opportunities for the characters to die, but you're not supposed to be intending on killing them, and that's a very big difference. Another thing you can do is try using waves of enemies in your boss encounters. and in your encounters, period, but boss encounters especially, if you start the encounter with 5 what I call mooks, which are just non-boss monsters, and they show up, but in your notes you've got down that on turn 3, or when at least half of those mooks are down, reinforcements show up, and then you bring in 5 more mooks, and then in turn 6, or when 3 more of those are down, you have the actual boss show up after they've been worn down a little bit. You've done waves of enemies, because a lot of times monsters in their lair areas in their dungeon will have reinforcements that they come in, but it might take them a couple of rounds to get there. And so you can write it in that on initiative round 3, initiative round 5 or 6, that these other waves of enemies come in. And that does something, especially in the action economy in a 4th or 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons game, because if you come in fresh on an encounter and you recognize it's a boss type encounter, you see the great big bad right there, or you see a bunch of enemies, or there's something to you to indicate that this is a big boss fight, a temptation for the characters who are fresh is to start blowing all of their limited use items right away. Start using their highest level spells, start using their limited use magic items, and basically blow their big encounter attacks right away and leave them short on resources, because an encounter is really a resource sink. That's really what you're trying to do with encounters. You're not necessarily trying to kill the characters, but you are trying to use up their resources. And by resources here, I don't mean their rations and their water and maybe ammunition, but what I really mean is ammunition like spell slots, limited use magic item usages, limited use magic items like consumables, powers and abilities that are only usable once per short rest, once per long rest. These kind of things are a limited number of uses, like the wild shape for a druid is only usable a couple of times until you get to much higher level. The bardic inspiration is only usable so many times. These are their resources, and they have these, generally speaking, throughout 24 hours of a day. You have only so many of some of these resources. Some characters do get some things back at short rest, but a lot of these resources are only coming back at long rest. So either using waves of enemies in the boss encounter, if you do intend to let them come up against the boss relatively fresh, or waves of encounters before you get to the boss encounter. It's kind of separate encounters, but without time to rest before they come up against the boss. Is that something you can do too? You can time the boss encounter in such a way to where they can't get a rest first. So if they're down to 50 or 25% of their normal resources by the time they hit the boss, it's going to be a lot harder encounter than if they're hitting it fresh. And if you don't weaken them with a few waves of minions, first of all. Okay? And so that's one of the things you can do to increase your entertainment value, your epic drama of your boss encounter. Then finally, I like to use what's called a transformative boss. Now, if you've read books, played video games, some of the most interesting in battles, the boss has multiple forms. You just about think you've got him beat, and then he comes back as something else. Classic example from Disney would be Maleficent, who she's a dark fairy through most of a battle with her, but then she turns into her dragon form, and now you have to fight her as a dragon. These are the kind of things that you want to do. It's called a transformative boss or a mutated boss. A lot of your Parasite Eve, Resident Evil type monsters are this way. You fight them to a certain point, and then they transform and they get tougher, and that will make the boss encounter more interesting. Now, when you're doing a transformative boss, there's a few things you got to remember. One, the boss needs to have what's called a hit point threshold. Instead of hit points, they have a hit point threshold. Basically, that means that they stay in one form until that threshold is met or exceeded, and any damage done over the threshold does not roll over into the new form. This guarantees that they're going to be there for at least as many, should be there for at least as many turns as they have forms. So, like, as an example, one of the ones I like to use is a primordial elemental. By primordial elemental, I mean he's not any one elemental. He encompasses all 4 elements. And what you're going to end up doing is fighting him in each of the 4 primal elements. And what you do is you give him a hit point total that's roughly equivalent to a single monster of the challenge rating that you're trying to fight. Because what you're going to do for each form they have, it's going to multiply the experience value of the creature. Because it's really like each form is like fighting another creature in like waves, but instead of in waves, the single creature is transforming. And you would err on the higher end for the hit points than the median, which is what's in the monster manual for these cases. So, like a 5th level encounter, let's take a 5th level monster just to take a look at it. There's an Alip, which is a 5th level undead monster. And they have about 40 hit points on the median, but they have 9 die 8 hit points. So they could have as many as 72 hit points. So we're thinking that a creature of this type, if we were going to base it around the Alip, might have a threshold of about 70 hit points. We were talking elemental though, so let's go ahead and close the Alip down, and let's go here and change it out of that. Go into our filters and go into monster type elemental and close it. And now you have an elemental. And as a 5th level elemental, right off the top is an air elemental. And the air elemental has 90 hit points in the median, but it has 12 die 10 plus 24 hit points. So it's 144 possible hit points for the air elemental. So I might make, that's almost 150 hit points threshold. Now, if I'm doing it this way, I would probably look at the other elementals before I went ahead and stuck with that much in hit points, just to be sure I'm not overdoing it. 12 die 6 plus 60, so Earth Elemental is also going to have a really high hit points. So a hit point threshold of 150 would not be out of the question for our primordial elemental. So how you'd write that is you'd write hit points 150 slash 150 slash 150 slash 150. Every elemental for the 4 forms has got 150 hit points. And this counts technically as 4 level 5 creatures. Now, we're talking about a boss battle. That means that the party's probably not level 5. But in a boss battle, 4 level 5 creatures bumps up the difficulty to the point where you're really at a boss battle. So 4 level 5 creatures against 3 to 5 player characters is closer to a boss level challenge, because a boss level challenge in my mind is 3 to 5 challenge ratings above, ultimately above the party, because if you get much more than 4 or 5, it becomes impossible. So if you're doing a standard party of 3 to 5 adventurers going against 4 elementals of challenge rating 5, is going to wear them down, and it's going to be more of a boss feeling encounter. So all we're doing is we're combining those 4 elementals into just one, and we're going to modify them a little bit. And how we do this now, we decide which one is going to be our first elemental form when they first encounter them, and go from there. And you can base it on the regular elementals. In fact, you can almost plug in the elementals as is, but you do want to remember that action economy. So let's say that we're looking at the fire elemental as our starting monster. Now, common damage resistances for elementals, they're all probably going to be resistant to like bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical attacks. They're all going to be immune to poison, but the fire elemental is going to be immune to fire. And then there's some conditional immunities, and a lot of them are going to be, all of them are going to be immune to exhaustion, grappling, paralyzing, petrification, poison, prone, restrained, unconscious. Now, the earth elemental is solid enough that grappling might not be one of its immunities, but you'll give all of these immunities to this creature, and you're probably going to give it a vulnerability too to kind of balance this out. It doesn't come with a vulnerability here, but in these transformative monsters, you usually want to give them a weak point to accentuate that this form has a weakness, but that it's going to change from form to form. So with fire, a lot of times I like to choose a weakness of cold attacks. It's the opposite element, so you're going to add that in as a vulnerability. You're already changing it, you're combining these creatures in, so you give them a vulnerability to cold. Then they have a few special abilities, like this one has a fire form, which says whenever you attack it with a touch or a weapon attack within 5 feet, you take a die 10 fire damage, and it can enter hostile spaces and things. So that's an ability that's always on. It's like one of the auras I talked about. So that fire elemental does damage every time you attack it with a melee attack within 5 feet or a touch attack. It gives off its own illumination. That's just window dressing, really. And it's got water susceptibility. So if it moves through water, or every gallon of water splash on it, it takes a cold damage. And that plays right into the cold vulnerability I said before. So if we added cold vulnerability to this, that cold 1 point of cold damage would increase to 2 because you gave it vulnerability. All right, and then you go to attacks. Now, luckily, the fire elemental already comes with multi-attack, which helps balance out your action economy. He gets to make 2 touch attacks. If it's 2 touch attacks and his basically fire form, he's pretty good to go against your group of characters already in the action economy. So you probably don't have to necessarily build another ability in there, but you might want to consider giving him 1 ranged attack. You might make it a recharge attack, so it's not something you can use all the time, but he might be able to throw a ball of fire at somebody with equivalent to hit and damage to one of his melee attacks, maybe a little bit better, equal or better than his melee attacks because he's more dexterous, but since it looks like his touch attack is mainly dexterity based and stuff, it would probably be about the same. So if he's +6 to attack with his touch attack, you might throw a throw ball of fire attack, one target for +6, and do similar damage. This does 2d6 plus 3. You might lower it a little bit because you're adding it as an extra attack, make it 2d4 plus 3. But it's fire damage again. And of course, it gets the same riders, like the flammable objects catch fire and such. But that's your first form. Now, you're going to go into your second form after they meet or exceed that hit point threshold. And also, of course, you looked at the different monsters. They had different armor classes. The hit point's about the only thing. You pretty much keep the same on a transformative monster. You just make them thresholds. But see, now we're going to go to, say, the Earth Elementals next. The transformation sequence, and this is where you get very creative in your description and role playing. You say how when they defeat it, the fires fade around the creature and the earth draws up from the ground and it solidifies into an earth elemental. They're still a large creature, so they've got a good big area. They've got a nice armor class. They've got their damage vulnerability is already in there. Thunder, they're weak against thunder attacks, so you don't have to add an extra vulnerability in this one because it's already there. The resistances are bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical weapons, just as before. Their immunity is poison. Their conditional immunity is exhaustion, paralyzed, petrification, poison, and unconscious. But they can be knocked prone. They can be grappled. And they don't have any specific resistance like the fire element. So you might want to give them a specific resistance, but you don't have to. They've got pretty good, though, damage resistances and vulnerabilities, but now you know that this one's vulnerable to thunder damage. So you've met the criteria of having the different forms have different vulnerabilities and immunities, so they have to change the way they attack it. They do have the ability of Earth Glide, which basically allows them to swim through the earth as a movement power. And it's a siege monster, so it does double damage against objects and structures. Always kind of interesting. It doesn't have an aura attack, but it does have a multi-attack. It gets to do 2 slam attacks. In the action economy, that's a little weak. But you might give it a lair action that you didn't necessarily give the fire elemental in the last example, because he had plenty of actions in the action economy between his fire form and his multi-attack. But he gets a multi-attack slam, and then in addition to that, you might be able to do a lair action that's an area of effect where it causes rocks to fall from the roof, and everybody has to make a dex save or take damage, and it'll be on the equivalency to the damage done by his slam attack, but a little bit lighter because of the fact that it's hitting multiple characters. So instead of a 2d8 plus 5 for the attack, you might make it 1d10 save for half. And then it'll be a dexterity save. It doesn't have to be great. You're just putting it in as an extra attack that they can do. And they can't use it. They either have to use their multi-attack or that attack. But that attack, you can go ahead and make it as a lair action that they do during somebody else's turn, or specifically at the end of the turn sequence. Is you can say they can do their lair action at the end of the turn sequence. A lot of times with lair actions, you want to give them a choice between 1 or 2. So you could say that he gets a lair action of that, or the ability to pull up more of the earth to heal himself for a hit dice worth of damage, which in this case, that would be a die 10 plus 5 hit points, because 12d10 plus 60 is his normal hit dice. So a die 10 plus 5, he could do once per turn as a heal if he chooses not to use the rock slide earthquake ability. And so you've changed the flavor of the battle again. And then after you get done with this 150 hit points, and again, like I said before, you don't let it flow over, so it's 150 or more. And then the next form, and we'll say that he crumbles and becomes bursts out as a giant tornado of wind, and he's an air elemental now. Has a different armor class again. Still has 150 threshold. He has a flying speed, which gives him hovering ability too, which is his only movement type. But that's another difference from the other two characters. He's got damage resistance to lightning and thunder, plus the non-magical weapon attacks. He's got immunity to poison, just like all elementals. He's got the conditional immunity to exhaustion, grapple, paralyze, petrification, poison, prone, restrained, and unconscious, like everybody but the earth elemental pretty much. But he doesn't have a vulnerability here. And so you might want to pick a vulnerability for him. What can disrupt air? You could say that because he's a conscious entity, you could make him vulnerable to psychic attacks, which is not a common one. You could say force attacks can break up him temporarily. That might even stun him for a round if you use a force attack on him, or something of that sort. You don't actually have to give him a vulnerability, but it's a good idea to kind of balance things out when you do these boss battles. He does have an air form, which gives him kind of a extra movement ability. It can land in a monster or in an enemy's space, and it can squeeze, which is important for like chase scenes. It does have the multi-attack like most of the other elementals, so it gets 2 attacks per round. But it does have a slam attack, which is a part of multi-attack, which is its basic attack. And then also it has a rechargeable whirlwind attack, which is an area of effect attack. It affects multiple creatures. So that kind of helps balance out the action economy again. So you really don't necessarily have to add another attack here. Now the whirlwind is a recharge attack, but that's okay. So he's pretty good as your third form of your elemental. As you see, you're doing as little actual changing as possible. You just want to give it a different feel with each stage of the attack, so that the characters feel like they're progressing and fighting a different flavor of enemy every time, but along a theme. Themes are good because it helps link everything together. In this case, our theme is elemental. Finally, after they get through 150 hit points of that, we're going to go to our water elemental, which is going to be down here further because we're all the way in the W's. Water elemental. All of the regular elementals are CR5s, which what makes them such a great example here for a fifth CR boss. Now, like I said, this counts as 4 of them, though. So remember, when you're giving out experience and/or milestones, that they are fighting a deadly encounter, because it counts as fighting 4 at their level for 3 to 5 characters. Now, when you have more or less characters, you do need to modify more or less, and that includes the action economy. If you're fighting with 8 characters at 5th level and 3 of them are melee classes, that's just the 3 melee classes is going to give you 6 attacks in the round, and then 5 non-melee, that's going to give you 5 more. So that's 11 attacks you got to compensate for a little bit. So you want to have at least 6 or 7 attacks in the round somehow, if you're going that big, and so you got to remember to take that into effect. And you can do that by like increasing their multi-attack, give them a 3rd slam attack, giving them a lair or legendary action. But you always want to keep that action economy in mind. Bigger parties needs more action economy, or another creature, or minions. And that's the thing. Any of these could possibly summon minions as one of their lair and or legendary actions too. Summon, like the water elemental might summon a few water weirds, which you saw were lower CR water elemental. But we go back in, we got a different armor class again. This one's a little bit lower at 14. This is your final set of 150 hit points. They have a swim speed in addition to the regular speed. So if you throw some water areas in the environment, that'll give them some advantages, and they give your players some disadvantages when they have to adapt to that. The resistance is here. They're resistant to acid is a new one, and of course all the mundane non-magical weapons. And they're immune to poison, as all of them are. Conditional immunities: exhaustion, grappling, paralysis, petrification, poison, prone, restrained, and unconscious. So pretty much the same as all the other less corporeal elementals. They do not have a weakness, though. I might give them a weakness. Since the fire elemental, I added the weakness to cold. The water elemental, I would probably add a weakness to fire-based attacks, just to balance it out a little bit. And that doesn't change too much. They have a water form that allows them to squeeze. They have a freeze, which means if they do take cold damage, it partially freezes them. Their speed is reduced by 20 feet until the end of the next turn. You can put a proviso there that if they're hit by a fire-based attack before the end of the turn, that their freeze is over with. Their multi-attack is again 2 slam attacks, pretty standard attack for most of your elementals. That gives them 2 attacks in the action economy. They do have a whelm, which is another area kind of attack for every creature in the creature's space. So that's another recharge ability, helps with the action economy a little bit. You could also say that if they partially freeze, that they gain a freezing aura that does, you don't have to do a lot of damage. It could only do like a die 4 damage to anybody within 5 feet of them, as the cold actually gets intensified by their water nature. That's another way to compensate for your action economy. You could say, like I said, they have the ability to give up their actions in the turn to summon some water weirds. And if we look at water weirds to see, they're 2 CRs lower. So you could say that they can summon like 1d4 water weirds to help out. And that would help with the action economy, because that would give you additional attacks. If you look at the water weird, as far as attacks go, they only have the 1 attack, so they're really only adding 1 to 4 additional actions. This way you're not worried about doing too many attacks by adding them. It is, of course, completely invisible in water, so if you add water to your environment, you have now made them a little bit harder to see, and that's added to your boss battle. So basically, to recap, when you're doing a boss battle, you want to, first off, tailor your boss encounter towards your party, or at least towards a generic adventuring party, so that there's a little bit of give and take with the different abilities. Yes, the abilities that players choose will still give them some advantages, but it's not going to be a skeleton key to get you past the boss. The skeleton key abilities are great for getting past low level or equal level encounters. They're great against mini bosses sometimes as a secret to maybe getting past them if you use them right. But when you're going to the actual big boss especially, you do want to take some of these quote-unquote skeleton key abilities that will normally trivialize an encounter and plan for them and put something in there to negate it. Give the boss an ability to heal or restore or shrug off a condition. Give them a ranged attack when they don't normally have one. Give them a melee attack if they usually only have ranged. Look at your characters. If your monster is typically one that mostly only has roll to attack type attacks, and of course most parties have one or two tanks that are really hard to hit, either give them an attack that has advantage, so that increases their chance to hit, or a multi-attack, so it increases their number of hits to possibly attack them, an auto-damaging aura, or a saving throw type attack to counterbalance that a little bit, but not completely eliminate the advantage. Watch your action economy. I will repeat that over and over again, but here in the recap especially, your action economy is key to making your adventures more fluid, more dynamic, and seem more fair, because if you just send 8 player characters, 12 player characters against one single monster who can't attack but once, maybe to 3 times, he's going to get overwhelmed every time because he doesn't have as many opportunities to fight back. Monsters like that, another way you can add to the action economy is giving them multiple reactions instead of just one. You can make them immune to attacks for a round somehow. Like the earth elemental might swim into the earth and not be able to be attacked for a round, and allowing him to heal. But yeah, look at your action economy and look at what your players can do, and remember that you want your boss especially to be able to do close to the same amount of actions, or if they don't do close to the same amount of actions, then the actions need to be bigger. A boss like the boss we just talked about, a 5th level boss that's transformative, going against a 5th level party, that's just really an equal encounter that have intensified by making it transformative, but all of its attacks are still at 5th level. If on the other hand you was going to go through a single form boss versus that same 5th level party, instead of running a 5th level boss, you would run a 9th level boss, and because he's going to do more damage, he's going to have a higher attack roll, so he's going to hit more often, and his area of effects are going to have more effect and have a harder saving throw to hit. He's going to have more special abilities, so they're going to balance things out. So this is what you do when you're building your encounter. Use your environment, and monsters set layers where they're comfortable. So a fire elemental is going to have burning magma around. A water elemental is going to have pools of water that it can retreat into. Earth elementals are going to be deep in the mountains and surrounded by stone and earth. And air elementals will want access to the sky. You know, they know their environment. A dragon usually lives in a big cave in the mountains if it's like a red dragon. A black dragon is often deep in the swamps because those are his natural environment. A white dragon is often in the glacial north or south, in areas that are very cold, and that's what they're comfortable with, and they can use that environment against the players with lair actions, or just actions that are based around their environment. Just like special setup encounters, set piece encounters, where you might give an ogre the ability to pull a stick out of the way and cause a cave in. when just the right moment and slow down the characters or stop them from getting away, even just blocking an exit. It's a set piece. It's not exactly a lair action, but it is involved with the current location they're in, and so you've used the environment. Try using waves of enemies. Either, as I said before, make the boss encounter after a series of encounters throughout the day, because the challenge rating system is based upon 6 to 8 medium to hard encounters between long rests. That's one of the underlying philosophies to the challenge rating system. The challenge rating system has a few. Its underlying philosophy is that it also expects 3 to 5 PCs in a party for the challenge rating. It is expecting initially options out of the player handbook being used. They do try to balance the new books as they come out, but of course unusual synergies are going to happen, so there's going to be a little bit of difference there. It does expect you to be using a standard array or point buy system, because if you got a character that started out with 3 18s before racial modifiers, they're going to be more effective than the character that started with the standard array or the point buy system, where the maximum they can start with is a 17. So those are going to be factored in. Some optional rules are factored in. Feats are kind of factored in because it's an optional rule, but most people do use them. And a lot of times the feats aren't necessarily as powerful as the ability score increases anyway, because the sooner you can get your character up to max ability score, the better, harder hitting it's going to be. But these are the baseline assumptions with the challenge rating system. So you want to adjust to that. And so like I said, use waves of enemies to soften up the characters before they get to the boss battle, whether it's waves of separate encounters or multi-stage encounters where reinforcements come in at turn 3 and at turn 7 and turn 10. Or even another way to do a wave type encounter is like with undead. You could have it that on turn 3, instead of reinforcements coming, the necromancer that's controlling them all raises all the ones that you knocked down again, so they're back. That's thematic. It makes it feel more dynamic, and now you have more creatures to fight again. Using monsters like zombies that have undead fortitude to allow them to keep getting back up when you drop them to 0 also kind of works in this wave type of thing. An example of more of a default quote-unquote transformative creature that's already in the book is oozes, where when you get them down to half hit points, they split. Or when you use slashing damage, they split into 2 creatures with half the hit points on both. Those are more book examples of like a semi-transformative monster, because you're using transformative bosses. These are the bosses that everybody remembers. When you go and you fight Bowser at the end of Mario and his attacks just change from one segment of the boss battle to another, that's a transformative boss, but you can be as transformative as you like and as creative as you like. Your boss battles are the keystones of your game. Your adventure, even in a one-shot, you usually want to cap it with one final battle. So you want to use those bosses, make those bosses count. Also remember, when you are doing your encounters, now I did say it's 6 to 8 medium to hard encounters in a day, but you could put as many as 13 or 15 encounters in a day, because you got to remember, among other things, not all encounters are combat. All 3 pillars have types of encounters. Really, for it to count as an encounter for this classification, it has to have the potential to use up resources. So an easy encounter is either a lower CR than a party, so you're using little to no resources, or maybe up to 10 or 15% of the resources. A equal encounter might be, 20 to 25% of resources, even all the way up to 50% of the resources are used up. Difficult encounters could use up to 75% of the resources, while deadly encounters could use 100 or more percent of their resources, which means sometimes you got to give them an opening to run away, or you got to let a character sacrifice himself so everybody else can run away, or not that you want to overuse this, but sometimes you want to turn a total party kill into a total party capture instead. So the last attack versus everybody is some kind of subdual attack. But remember, you're voting, you're rooting for the players to win just as much as they are, but you are presenting encounters where they can lose, they can die. And an occasional total party kill, or character kill at least, will remind them that death is possible. So they'll remember that running away is a viable strategy. Talking their way around an encounter is a viable strategy. Sneaking their way around an encounter is a viable strategy, or finding an alternate route is a viable strategy in the game. You never want to make the players feel like they're railroaded, although in some cases you got a little bit more leeway in that. Like you can railroad them a little bit in a dungeon or mega dungeon environment where there are just limited paths they can take to get through the maze type of corridors that they're going through. But take your environment, take your waves of enemies, take your action economy into effect, and really build a boss encounter that they're going to remember and tell their friends about. And that will be the capstone of that arc. And then you can sprinkle things into the treasure and the wrap up to possibly be a hook to the next arc that you want them to go through. And as a final note in building your boss encounters, when you're dealing with bosses that are intelligent, and especially if they're more of a humanoid bent, and you give them magic treasure, you can let the boss use that magic treasure without necessarily having to up the difficulty experience-wise in the encounter, because the reward is the magic item. So if you have a Death Knight that's your boss, and you have a +2 flaming sword in the treasure, the Death Knight could be wielding the flaming sword. Or if you're having them go up against an animated weapon, and the animation is caused by like a curse or something, if the animated weapon could have a bonus because it is animating a magic weapon. So it could be that +2 flaming sword that's an animated sword. So you use all the stats for animated sword, but it gets the +2 and it gets the extra fire damage. And then when you defeat it, the animation goes away, but the +2 flaming sword is still there. And it might even have an ability, now that you've conquered it and attuned to it, to where, once a day you can use it as a dancing sword as well. Keep it thematical. But you can take your treasure items as a way to also kick your bosses up another notch and add to the verisimilitude and the immersion of your game, because it makes more sense if a boss knows they've got a +2 weapon in their treasury and they can use that weapon. A boss knows to use it, unless his other abilities are more powerful or more thematic for him. This also includes things like if he's got 4 or 5 or 6 healing potions in his treasure, and he can take the time to do it and sacrifice an action to do it, he can go grab one of the potions and heal himself, or grab another potion in gaseous form to escape, because bosses can escape. If it's looking like your boss is going to get defeated way too early, or just get defeated but has an opening, and their boss is smart and a coward, or just smart and is ready to live another day because you want him to be a mega boss later, this was just your first encounter with the boss, because often we have these like previews of the boss. They come in and they taunt you for 2 or 3 rounds and then they escape. You might even write that into your notes, that he's only there for 3 turns, then he escapes. let the boss escape and let them use what they have to escape. Just don't make it unbelievable. Don't make it look like every time the player's about to kill him, he escapes, and then they're about to kill him, then he escapes. About to kill. They're never going to kill this boss. They have to get that sense of accomplishment of finally killing the boss. When it all comes down to it, you're responsible for the fun that your party is having. Make it fun, make it interesting, make it dynamic, and make it unique. Don't just, for boss encounters, pick a monster out of the monster manual and be done with it. There's some that you can do this with, and it's okay. I mean, especially when you get into your Elder Dragons, your Demons, your Tarrasque. Some of those will work just fine all by themselves. But for the most part, when you're getting into bosses and mini-bosses, it's a little bit better to pick your environment, to modify them a little bit, to reskin them. If you've got a metagamey player that knows that all trolls regenerate, but his character's never met one in his life or never heard of a troll, you might make the troll some other kind of troll. Instead of regenerating, he might slowly get coated with ice every time you hit him, and his attacks start adding ice damage. He might regenerate unless he's hit by a different type of damage than fire and acid. Those may not be what stops his regeneration. Those might even add to his regeneration. He might be immune to fire or acid. These are the things you can do to stop those metagamey people and make the boss a little bit more beefy. Again, I want to thank you for tuning in to the RPG College. This has been a video in the Ross. Of course, the ums, the ahs, and the occasional cough doesn't get edited out. But I want to thank you for listening. I'm Doc. I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons for 42 years with every edition of the game. So one of these days I might get it right. And I want to welcome you to visit me again here and see what else I want to blather on about for an hour. And have a wonderful day. Make sure that if you're watching this on my YouTube channel, or if it does get added to a convention like VisionCon's virtual convention, that you leave comments and let people know that you like what you see. Thank you, and have a good day. And remember, social distancing.